When you think of Generation 1 Pokemon, these images most likely come to mind, but did you know that they actually looked very different? You see, to find out if Gen 1 Pokemon do have the best designs, we first have to take a look at where they started and how they evolved throughout time. But back in 1996, Ken Sugimori, the lead artist of Game Freak, drew them with much less even and conventional body proportions. The feet, especially for some Pokemon, were way too big, while the rest of the body seemed squished in on itself, which resulted in scale and size being much harder to accurately convey from the pictures alone. Some eye placements were strange, and many mods had a similar pentagon-like head shape, even Mew and Mewtwo. But overall, many designs were grounded in nature, not stretching the boundaries of the animal or object they were portraying too much. And mammal Pokemon were almost always fatter and more round in comparison to the Gen 3 remake artworks. Now, I know what you're thinking. Some of these drawings are so bad, and I honestly can't imagine the series picking up like it did back then if these artworks were used now. Though you have to imagine art styles back in the late 90s were more like this for anime in general. They were less clean and saturated with colors, as well as the artist trying to figure out the art direction he wants to go with these Pokemon. Though none of these Pokemon were so bad that they're unrecognizable from their later interpretations. And I have to admit that these artworks have the most important feature when getting to know someone: personality. Although they don't look as good, they definitely convey much more emotion and feeling through either their eyes, pose, or facial expressions, while the newer interpretations tend to be more neutral. Though to be fair, some of the original designs are nearly exactly the same as the remakes, with only slight differences in pose, shape, and coloring. But even when their arts were redone in Fire Red and Leaf Green, their biggest design problems that many people from my comment section dislike about this generation couldn't be fixed. You see, not only were the designs a byproduct of the art style of that time period, but also the technological limitations. The original Game Boy only had 4 colors and could display 2 colors on screen at once, respective to the game's versions. So designs overall had to be simple. But does this limitation actually make them worse designs? Well, every Pokemon, regardless of what generation they come from, have at least 2 concepts to their designs. The most common pair is a natural concept, usually an animal or a plant, accompanied with a man-made concept like a sumo wrestler or a top hat, or something relating to its typing like a flame tail, or obviously identifiable type coloring. The goal is to mix these natural, man-made, or any other concepts together in a fun, unique, and subtle way that isn't too obnoxiously obvious, bland, or extreme. And many Pokemon from Gen 1 work with this simple application of 2 concepts being mixed together. The best example being Charizard, which is just an orange-colored fire-breathing dragon monster accompanied with appropriate rigid and sharp design features to further impose the intimidation a fire-breathing dragon would. But the problem in Gen 1 comes from too much Pokemon of the same typing having 2 similar design concepts with little variety. For example, nearly every fire-type Pokemon from Gen 1 is just a red, yellow, or orange body-colored versions of their inspired animals with a flame somewhere, and all fighting types having a real-world fighting item or element like punching gloves or having too much humanoid features. However, as much as I don't like Pokemon designs that are too humanoid, pure fighting types, which are most of the ones in Gen 1, are almost always blatantly humanoid in comparison to Pokemon with dual fighting and something else, so they are the exception. And in all fairness, Pokemon back then with the same typing needed obvious colors and items that would easily identify them as their respective typing, because this was the first game in the series. No one would have had previous knowledge of what can be any type of Pokemon, especially not the 1,000+ examples like we have today, so they needed to be a bit more direct, especially for kids. But this doesn't excuse the many basic concepts that were used. They could have made the designs have more variety, especially when it came to some of the Pokemon's features. Like there's this reoccurring round generic SpongeBob shoe leg that always looks terrible whenever it's used. With that all being said though, Gen 1 has some of the most timeless and best Pokemon designs ever, nostalgia aside. And that's usually when they use more unique concepts to better diversify the animal it's portraying. This is usually the case when Pokemon have some elements inspired off of Yokai, which are supernatural creatures in Japanese folklore. One of my favorite examples is Magikarp, which is a Japanese carp-like fish that, according to real-world folklore, when it swims upstream and manages to jump to the top of the waterfall, it will turn into a dragon. And according to many of Magikarp's Pokédex entries, it does exactly that. At level 20 at least. And even for such a simple fish design, it's still a mixture of a carp and a yellow eye rock fish, which has so much more complexity than, for example, I don't know, just a blue toad with Mickey Mouse gloves and Amogus legs. Another good example, Drowsy is inspired off of a tapir and the Yokai Baku, which is a mixture of many animals and has a trunk and likes to eat dreams just like Drowsy, evidently seen in the Pokédex entry where another example, Vulpix and Ninetales being based off of Kitsune, with the power of it corresponding to the increased number of tails it has. But just because a Pokemon is based off of a yokai doesn't mean it's a good design. An example of this is Jinx, which is apparently based off of Yama-Uba, which is a mountain witch that transforms into beautiful women to lure lost hikers and kill them. Though Jinx is a modern representation of that by adopting the very popular fashion trend in the 90s in Japan called the Ganguro. Hence why it has a contrasting skin color, blonde hair, and a red dress instead of a more traditional kimono, and sings and dances referring to the more 90s pop of that trend instead of moving its hair like the Yama-Uba does. I really don't like both the Ganguro fashion trend and Jinx's relation towards it because it's just harder to tell what Jinx even is, especially if you didn't grow up in Japan, as well as the design just looking really ugly. I would have preferred a more traditional take on its yokai like Frostlass is with its kimono and ghost appearance referring to the Yuki Onna. Regardless, Pokemon don't need to be based off of yokai to be good. Sometimes their design concepts, although simple and not too daring, is executed well in subtle ways. Which is why I think Pikachu is so much better of a design than say Rattata. Sure, it's normal type so it needs to look more like a conventional rat, but still Pikachu isn't just a yellow colored mouse. According to this interview with Atsuko Nishida, the other designer who worked with Ken Sugimori and created most of the Kyoto Pokemon, revealed that Pikachu is based off of squirrels, which explains why it keeps its electricity in its cheeks, why its tail is cute and comes up to its back instead of a more conventional rat tail like Raticate, and possibly explains the two markings on its back that resemble squirrel patterns. Though Satoshi Taijiri, the original game's director, interpreted Pikachu as a mouse, which is why it's identified as one in the Pokédex, but that's the beauty of Pikachu's design. It's not too plain and directly a rat or squirrel, but it also doesn't have too much foreign concepts that break the immersion of its natural design elements, like a blatantly man-made object or modern concept would. And in fairness to Gen 1, many designs do this. Although basic at face value, many have foreign design concepts subtly implemented into their more conventional animal anatomies to give it some unique elements that sometimes even complement their typing. And other times, some meaning in design is lost in translation from the original Japanese names to English. Magmar's Japanese name being Buba, referring to this bird, and the word burn as seen with Magmorta's Japanese name, though that still doesn't cover all its design elements. So although Gen 1 definitely had less variety in the Pokemon concepts and uniqueness in conveying types, and having some really lazy or just bad ideas for designs, there are so many timeless Pokemon designs that are grounded in nature, accompanied with a unique mixture of unique concepts, which I prefer, and that set the stone on how Pokemon will look like for the next decade. Till this day, some of these designs have been my favorite, even though I've seen them in nearly every Pokemon game. So that's why, as a collective, out of all 9 generations, I would rank Gen 1's Pokemon designs as the 3rd best. But this raises 2 questions. If Gen 1 is already ranked so high, does this mean that Pokemon designs are getting worse? And what about each gen's shiny colors? Are they getting worse? You can find that out in these videos here.